Take a good look at this thing, because your brain is going to fight you the entire time you stare at it. That is not a fighter jet. That is not a stealth bomber. That is a passenger plane, a real one, designed to carry 361 people across oceans. And it looks like somebody folded an airliner in half and decided the fuselage was optional. Stick with me until the end, because the story of how this shape came to exist, why the biggest names in aviation are quietly circling it, and the brutal reason it still might never carry you anywhere, is one of the wildest things happening in the sky right now. Let's start with the obvious question. Where's the tube? Every single airliner you have ever flown on follows the same basic recipe. A long cylindrical tube for the people and the bags. 2 wings bolted to the sides, a tail at the back to keep everything pointed the right way. We have been building planes this way for basically 100 years. Boeing does it, Airbus does it, Embraer does it. That tube and wings layout is so standard that most people don't even realize it's a choice. It just looks like what an airplane is supposed to look like. And here's the thing, nobody tells you at the gate. That tube is basically dead weight. Aerodynamically, the fuselage of a normal jet is mostly just drag. Here's the uncomfortable truth. It carries the passengers, sure, but it does almost nothing to help the plane actually fly. It's a heavy metal cylinder being dragged through the air at hundreds of miles an hour, punching a hole in the wind the whole way, while the wings, bolted onto the sides, do all the real work of holding the aircraft up. The tube is a passenger, not a contributor. It just goes along for the ride, adding weight and adding drag, mile after mile after mile. Engineers have understood this for decades. It's not a secret. The tube and wing layout survives not because it's efficient, but because it's convenient. A cylinder is dead easy to build. It's dead easy to pressurize because a round cross-section handles internal pressure beautifully, like a soda can. It fits neatly through existing airports. It's a comfortable, well-understood compromise. But make no mistake, it is a compromise. From a pure efficiency standpoint, hauling that big empty tube around is one of the biggest wasteful habits in all of aviation. And for a century, we've just accepted it as the price of flying. So a handful of people looked at that century-old compromise and asked a dangerous question. What if the entire airplane was the wing? What if you could make the part that carries people also be the part that generates lift? No dead weight, no draggy tube, just one continuous, beautiful, lifting shape slicing through the sky. That's the Flying V. And I need you to understand where this idea actually came from, because it's genuinely not what you'd expect. It didn't come out of a Boeing skunkworks or a secret Airbus lab guarded by men in dark suits. It started as a student's thesis project. A young engineer named Justus Benad, working on his graduation project connected to Airbus in Hamburg, sketched out this radical idea of an aircraft shaped like the letter V, where the passengers, the cargo, and the fuel would all live inside the wings themselves. No separate tube. The wing is the cabin. The cabin is the wing. One idea, born on a student's desk, that could rewrite how we cross the planet. Think about that for a second. Some of the most transformative ideas in aviation history didn't start in giant corporate boardrooms. They started with one person asking, why does it have to be this way, and having the nerve to sketch out a different answer. Benad's answer was this strange, elegant V. Then Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, one of the most respected aerospace schools on the entire planet, picked up the concept and started seriously developing it back in 2016. And that's when this stopped being a cool drawing and started becoming an actual engineering program with real money, real researchers, and real ambitions behind it. Under project leader Roelof Vos, an associate professor of aerospace engineering, the Flying V became a full-blown research line with permanent staff and graduate students digging into overall aircraft design, aerodynamics, systems integration, control and stability, structures, and even the noise the thing would make. This wasn't a side hobby. This was one of Delft's serious bets on the future of flight. And the concept got its big public moment in October 2019, when KLM unveiled a scale model of the Flying V during the celebrations for the airline's 100th anniversary. Picture that. One of the oldest airlines on Earth, marking a century in the sky, and choosing to put a radical wing-shaped aircraft front and center as a symbol of where flying might go next. That's not the behavior of an industry that's scared of new ideas. That's an industry publicly flirting with them. Benad himself, who became the concept's chief engineer and joined the Delft faculty, kept saying there were ongoing projects to improve the design, on aerodynamics, on structures, on noise, on how it behaves in flight. This thing was alive and evolving. here's where it gets interesting. Because when you merge the fuselage into the wing, something genuinely beautiful happens to the physics. Let me try to make this intuitive, because it's the whole ball game. Think about dragging your hand through water. If you hold your hand flat and slice it through edge first, it moves easily. Turn it broadside and it fights you the whole way. A normal airplane fuselage is a bit like that broadside hand. It's a big surface being shoved through the air that doesn't earn its keep. Engineers describe an aircraft's efficiency partly in terms of how much surface area it drags through the air compared to how much useful volume it actually has inside. The Flying V's project leader, Roelof Vos, explained it in a really clean way. The Flying V is smaller than the A350 and has less of that inflow surface area compared to the amount of usable volume it carries. Less surface fighting the air for the same amount of stuff inside. The result is simply less resistance. And less resistance means less fuel needed to travel the same distance. You get rid of that draggy tube. The whole aircraft becomes a lifting surface. Less resistance, less weight. Preliminary calculations from the Delft team showed the design has significantly less drag than a modern widebody like the A350 or the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, and the structural weight came out significantly lower too. And when the team ran all the numbers together, comparing their design against the Airbus A350, which is genuinely one of the most advanced and efficient airliners flying today, they came up with a figure that makes airline executives sit up very straight in their chairs. 20%. The Flying V is projected to burn around 20% less fuel than an A350 over the same route, carrying roughly the same number of passengers, the same amount of cargo. Same job, same passengers, same cargo. 20% less gas in the tanks. Now, if you don't work in aviation, 20% might sound nice, but not earth-shattering. Let me translate that into a language airlines actually understand. Fuel is one of the single biggest costs an airline has. For a long-haul carrier, it's often the #1 expense, bigger than salaries, bigger than aircraft financing, bigger than almost anything else on the balance sheet. A 20% cut in fuel burn is not an improvement. It's a revolution. It's the kind of number that reshapes entire business models. It's the difference between a route that loses money and a route that prints it. And on top of the money, it's a massive cut in carbon emissions at a time when aviation is under enormous pressure to clean up its act and prove it has a future that isn't drowning in kerosene. So you've got a design that could slash costs and slash emissions at the same time. That's the holy grail. That's the thing everybody in this industry has been chasing for 30 years. And it came from a student sketch and a university team in Delft. You starting to see why people are paying attention? A student sketch developed by a top university, backed by a century-old airline, promising to cut one of aviation's biggest costs by a fifth. If even half of that promise holds up at full scale, it's the kind of thing that could ripple through every airline balance sheet on the planet. And that's exactly why the big players can't afford to look away. But let me pump the brakes for a second, because I promised you the truth, and the truth is more interesting than the hype. The numbers I just gave you, that 20% come from calculations, wind tunnel tests, and computer models. They are serious, credible numbers from serious engineers who have spent years on this. But there has never been a full-size Flying V that has flown. Not once. What actually got off the ground was something much smaller. And that story, honestly, is the best part of this whole thing. Back in the summer of 2020, the Delft team built a scale model. A flying one. This came after extensive wind tunnel testing and a whole battery of ground tests, so by the time it reached a runway, it had already earned its shot. The model was about 3 meters wide, with a length of a little under 3 meters, weighing roughly 22.5 kilograms. Think of a very serious, very expensive drone shaped like a tiny Flying V, packed with sensors and radio gear and batteries. It was controlled over a radio link. It had 2 small electric ducted fan engines, each putting out a few kilowatts, and a lithium polymer battery pack weighing several kilograms all on its own, a real chunk of the aircraft's total weight. That's the reality of battery-powered flight. The battery is heavy, and it's a huge fraction of everything you're trying to lift, and they needed somewhere to fly it. Not just any field. Somewhere with permission for experimental aircraft, controlled airspace, room to run, and people who knew how to keep everyone safe if something went wrong. The whole professional setup. You can't just take a one-of-a-kind experimental aircraft to a park and hope for the best. So where did they go? A guarded airbase in Germany. And who was there helping them run the test? A team from Airbus. Let that sink in for a second, because it completely rewrites the story you might have in your head. The idea that Airbus is sitting in a boardroom terrified of this design, biting its nails, praying it goes away, that's not what happened. Airbus was on the tarmac. Airbus provided the location because they run their own experimental flights there and already had the permissions. Airbus engineers were part of the effort. When you dig into how this actually works, the giants of the industry aren't running from radical designs like this. They're circling them, studying them, sometimes quietly funding the research. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about these companies. If a blended wing shape really is the future, the absolute last thing Boeing or Airbus wants is to be the company that ignored it and got left behind. And it goes further. KLM, the Dutch national airline, one of the oldest airlines in the entire world, actually helped sponsor the Flying V's development and unveiled a scale model publicly during its 100th anniversary celebration back in 2019. This wasn't some fringe project everyone was afraid of. It had a major airline's name attached to it, a plane load of industry attention, and serious institutional muscle behind it. Okay, so back to Germany. The little Flying V is sitting on the runway. And I want to walk you through this flight beat by beat because it did not go perfectly, and the imperfections are exactly what make it real. The drone pilot for the flight was a Delft PhD candidate named Nando van Arnhem, flying the model manually from the ground with a remote control. And the tension going in was real. The engineer's biggest fear was something they call rotation. That's the moment of takeoff when the nose lifts and the aircraft angles up to leave the ground. Their calculations had warned them that on this weird V-shaped design, rotation might be a serious problem. Lift the nose too early, angle too steep, and the whole thing could become uncontrollable and crash right there on the runway in front of everyone. There were other gremlins too, the kind that never show up in a computer model. During testing, they found interference on the radio link. The antenna wasn't reliably sending back critical data, like the drone's speed, to the ground station. Imagine trying to fly something without knowing how fast it's going. They had to swap in a better radio module just to fix it. Then there was the center of gravity, and this one is genuinely nerve-wracking. If the balance point of the aircraft is even slightly off, it becomes unstable and can drop right out of the sky. After running balancing tests, they discovered the center of gravity was sitting further back than their earlier math had predicted, so they had to physically stuff extra weight into the nose and shift the landing gear forward, right there, on location, to get it right. Even getting the thing to Germany was a saga in itself. The model's wingspan of just over 3 meters was slightly too wide to lay flat in the back of a truck. Think about how mundane and yet how telling that is. You've built this cutting-edge aircraft, and you can't even fit it in a truck to drive it to the runway. So a student had to sit down and figure out a clever way to load it diagonally, at an angle, just to get it to the airbase in one piece. Nothing about this was easy. Every single step was a small engineering puzzle that had never been solved before, because nobody builds airplanes shaped like this. And when they got there, the aircraft still couldn't just leap into the air. Some things you simply cannot predict from a desk, and can only discover on the spot. That radio interference I mentioned surfaced right there during checks on the ground. The center of gravity issue only revealed itself during balancing tests on location. This is the unglamorous reality of real flight testing that never makes the highlight reel. It's not a triumphant montage. It's a small team of people problem-solving under pressure, sweating the details, moving weights around by hand, swapping parts, running the numbers again, because the price of getting it wrong is watching years of work smash itself into a German runway in a couple of seconds. Let me paint the actual moment of truth for you, because it's genuinely tense. The Flying V is finally ready on the runway on the last test day. Van Arnhem is standing on the ground, operating it manually with a remote control, and the pressure on him is immense. Everything has to be perfect on takeoff. A tiny deviation in the nose wheel could veer the aircraft right off the runway. And then comes the single most critical second of the entire flight: rotation. The instant the Flying V lifts its nose to leave the ground. Rotate too early, let the angle get too steep, and the aircraft could become uncontrollable right then and there. Meanwhile, 2 of his teammates are hunched over a screen, reading him live numbers on speed, altitude, and angle, feeding him the data his own eyes can't give him from a distance. 3 people, 1 aircraft, 1 shot. And it worked. The aircraft responded exactly as they'd hoped. It rotated cleanly and climbed away into the German sky. And then, finally, the moment. Van Arnhem operated it from the ground, eyes locked on the aircraft, while 2 teammates fed him live data on speed, altitude, and angles off a screen. As he put it, they were basically flying with 3 pilots at once. The Flying V rolled down the runway, hit rotation speed at around 80 kilometers an hour, and lifted off. And it flew. It actually flew. It took off. It ran through a series of test maneuvers and approaches. It drained its batteries almost to empty, and then it came back down. But here's the honest part. The landing was rough. The model came down on its front wheel instead of its rear wheels, which damaged the nose and the wheel. And in the air, the aircraft showed a tendency the engineers had actually predicted, something called Dutch roll, a kind of wobbling, side-to-side, yawing motion that made it genuinely difficult to keep the wings level. The pilot had to work hard to hold it straight. It wanted to wander. It wanted to wobble. If you're rooting for this plane, that might sound discouraging. It absolutely shouldn't, because here's what actually matters. The single most important question going into that flight was, would this bizarre shape actually fly, stay stable enough, and be controllable? And the answer that came back was yes. The rough edges, the Dutch roll, the hard landing, those are data. That's exactly what a test flight is for. You fly it to find out what the equations can't tell you. As the project leader Roelof Vos put it, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. You have to actually fly it to know for sure. And now they knew. They walked away with something no computer could have given them, real behavior from a real aircraft in real air. Let me spend a second on that Dutch roll, because the name alone is fun, and the problem is a real one that even normal airliners have to deal with. Dutch roll is a kind of combined wobble, where the aircraft yaws side to side while also rocking its wings in a coupled, rhythmic motion. Picture the tail wagging one way while the wings rock the other in an awkward little dance. On conventional airliners, this tendency exists too, but engineers tame it with the tail fin and with automatic systems that quietly correct it hundreds of times a second before you ever feel it. The Flying V, with its unusual shape and its short body, showed more of this tendency in that early model, which made keeping the wings level genuinely tricky for the pilot on the ground. And here's the important bit. The team had actually predicted this in their earlier estimates. The flight didn't surprise them with a brand new problem. It confirmed a known challenge and gave them hard numbers to attack it with. That's the difference between a disaster and a data point. In aviation, the same wobble can be either one, depending on whether you saw it coming. The plan from there was exactly what you'd hope for from good engineers. Take all that flight data, feed it into a refined aerodynamic model of the aircraft, program that model into a flight simulator, and use it to figure out how to make future versions more stable and better behaved. Then repair the model and go fly again. That's how this works. You don't leap from a sketch to an airliner. You inch toward it, one flight, one wobble, one fix at a time. And they didn't stop at a single flight. That first campaign at the German airbase involved the model taking to the air multiple times, gathering data on each run, building up a real picture of how the Flying V behaves through the air rather than just how the equations said it should. Each flight is a few more pieces of the puzzle. A little more confidence here, a flagged concern there, a number to refine in the model. This is the slow, patient, deeply unsexy grind of turning a radical idea into something you could one day certify. There are no shortcuts. There's no single magic flight where the whole thing is suddenly proven. There's just the accumulation of evidence, flight after flight, until eventually, maybe, the case becomes undeniable. Or until the money runs out, or the will fades, or a better idea comes along. That's the knife's edge every experimental aircraft lives on. If you're enjoying this deep dive, do me a quick favor and smash that like button and subscribe if you want more journeys into the strange edges of aviation. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. Now let's talk about what it would actually be like to sit inside one of these things, because it is not like any flight you have ever taken in your life. Picture the cabin. On a normal widebody, you've got the fuselage, one long tube, and everybody sits in rows down its length, single file, staring at the seat back in front of you. On the Flying V, you're sitting inside the wings. The passenger cabin is built into the two legs of the V, plus the section that connects them at the front. The design was configured to hold around 361 passengers in a two-class layout, which is right in the same ballpark as an A350. So this is a serious long-haul aircraft, not some novelty toy. This is meant to fly you across the Atlantic, and the space inside is genuinely unusual. The team designed an oval-shaped pressurized cabin because a rounded shape holds pressure more efficiently, and that gave them freedom to sculpt the aerodynamics around it. The main cabin was designed to be around 6.1 meters wide, which is actually wider than the cabin of the Boeing 777X, one of the biggest twin-aisle jets currently out there. The ceiling height comes in comparable to the lower deck of the enormous Airbus A350. So despite the strange shape, we are absolutely not talking about a cramped little pod. There's real room in there, real space to breathe. but there are quirks you would absolutely notice. Because of how the cabin sits at an angle inside the wing, roughly 27 degrees relative to the direction the plane is actually flying, the designers had to think very carefully about how passengers would experience angles and tilt during different phases of flight. Here's one of the wildest examples. On a normal jet, when you land, the aircraft touches down slightly nose up. The Flying V is different. Because of its shape, the aircraft is actually designed to touch down pitched nose down to an angle of around -3 degrees. Why on earth would you land nose down? Because at that angle, the wing stops producing lift entirely. And once the wing isn't lifting anymore, the plane settles firmly onto the runway and can start braking hard without any risk of skidding or floating. It's a completely counterintuitive solution that only makes sense once you realize the whole aircraft is a wing. And the engineers even worked out what that means for you in your seat. Because the cabin sits at that 27-degree angle, when the aircraft pitches 3 degrees nose down on landing, a passenger inside would only feel a gentle forward tilt of roughly 2 degrees, barely noticeable. They designed it so the physics of the wing and the comfort of the passenger both work out at the same time. And there's a nice weight bonus hidden in there too. Because of the geometry, the nose landing gear can be shorter than the main landing gear, and shorter gear means less weight, and less weight means, you guessed it, better efficiency. Everything in this design feeds back into everything else. Let's go deeper inside that cabin, because the engineering is genuinely clever. The interior volume is used up primarily by 3 things: the passenger cabin, the cargo hold, and those fuel tanks, all packed into the wings. Passengers sit in both legs of the V, as well as in the connecting center body up front. The main cabin was configured in a 10 abreast layout, meaning 10 seats across, which is the same seating density as some of the widest jets flying. And to make that work, the designers gave it 4 aisles instead of the usual 2, which means passengers could spread out and move around far more easily, and crucially, could board and get off the plane much faster. Faster turnaround at the gate is money in an airline's pocket. Now, building a cabin inside a wing creates a structural nightmare, and I love how they solved it. Structural analysis showed the aircraft needed reinforcement in the form of 3 distinct internal walls, one at the beginning of each leg of the V, and one right down the plane's line of symmetry. Walls inside a cabin sound like a claustrophobic disaster, right? So the engineers cut large openings into those walls exactly where the aisles pass through, so the reinforcement is basically hidden inside the furnishings and you'd hardly know it was there. And because the wing wraps around the cabin in that oval shape, there are pairs of vertical posts running up either side of the cabin at regular intervals. Every one of these details is a compromise between physics, strength, and making sure a human being actually wants to sit in there. Even the doors got reinvented. The design includes 4 large Type A doors on each side of the cabin, which technically could allow a very high-density version to seat over 400 passengers. 2 of those doors sit side by side on each side, connected by a cross aisle, so that in an emergency, people could get out fast. And that same setup means faster, smoother boarding when everything's normal. These are the kinds of problems that only exist because the entire concept of where the people sit got completely reinvented from scratch. So imagine actually walking on board. You step through one of those big Type A doors, and instead of turning into a single narrow tube stretching far ahead of you, you find yourself in a wide space with 4 aisles fanning out, seats spread 10 across, the cabin opening up sideways into the 2 legs of the V. It would feel less like walking into a pipe and more like stepping into a wide, angled hall. You'd find your seat, and depending on where you're sitting, you might be deep inside a leg of the V, angled slightly relative to the direction of travel. The whole geometry of flying would feel subtly, interestingly different from anything you've experienced. Same journey, completely reimagined container. The cockpit is another neat detail. It was modeled on the flight deck of the Airbus A350, a smaller regional jet designed for 2 pilots with room for a couple of jump seats. And the floor of the flight deck sits about 40 centimeters higher than the main cabin floor, specifically so the nose landing gear can tuck away neatly underneath the pilot's feet. Think about how much creative problem solving is packed into just that one detail. They raised the pilot's floor to create a hidden garage for the front wheel. Every single centimeter of this aircraft is a puzzle that had to be solved from zero, because you can't just copy the answers from a tube and wing jet. Nothing transfers cleanly. Nothing. It's a blank sheet of paper in an industry that absolutely hates blank sheets of paper. Let me put the Flying V head to head with the A350 for a second, because the comparison is genuinely striking. The A350-1000 is Airbus's flagship long-haul jet, one of the most advanced airliners ever built. a machine that airlines around the world fly across oceans every single day. The Flying V was designed to go toe-to-toe with it. Same wingspan, roughly the same passenger count, in the neighborhood of 361 seats in a two-class layout. Roughly the same cargo capacity, in the region of 160 cubic meters. In other words, it does the same job. It flies the same kind of routes. It carries the same kind of load. The only real difference is that it's projected to do all of that while burning about a fifth less fuel. That's the entire pitch in one sentence. Same mission, dramatically less gas. And notice what the design deliberately did not try to do. It didn't try to be bigger, or carry more people, or fly further than everything else. It picked a proven, real-world benchmark, the workhorse widebody, and simply tried to do that exact job more efficiently. That's a smart, disciplined engineering target. It makes the aircraft directly comparable, directly useful, and directly sellable if it ever gets built. Now here's a clever bit of engineering that shows how much real-world thought went into making this thing actually usable at real airports. The Flying V is shorter than an A350, but it was deliberately designed to have the exact same wingspan. Why does that matter so much? Because airport gates, taxiways, and hangars are all sized around specific aircraft dimensions. There are entire international categories for this. By matching the wingspan of an existing widebody, the Flying V could theoretically slide right into the airport infrastructure we already have. No rebuilding terminals, no special gates, no tearing up taxiways. It's designed to fit into the world as it already exists, which is exactly the kind of practical thinking that separates a genuine engineering proposal from a pretty fantasy. And it doesn't stop at the flight tests. The Delft team also took the Flying V into a flight simulator, one of their advanced research simulators, so that a test pilot could actually climb in and get a real feel for how this revolutionary aircraft handles from inside the cockpit. A test pilot took the controls, the stick in his hands, and flew a Flying V that exists so far only as data and math brought to life inside the simulator. Because here's the thing people forget. A plane isn't just about aerodynamics on paper. It's about whether a human being can actually fly it. Intuitively. Safely. When they're exhausted at the end of a 12-hour transatlantic haul in bad weather with the automation acting up. Can a real pilot keep this strange V-shaped machine under control and land it in one piece, over and over, thousands of times, reliably? That question is every bit as important as the fuel numbers, and it's exactly the kind of thing you have to explore before you'd ever dream of putting passengers on board. Getting a pilot's genuine, hands-on impressions of an aircraft this radically different is a crucial piece of the puzzle. And the fact that the team invested in doing this, methodically, step by step, tells you everything about the spirit of the project. This was never a flashy stunt for a press release. It was real research, done properly, by people who understand that a revolutionary aircraft has to be revolutionary in 100 small, careful, unglamorous ways before it's ever allowed near a paying customer. So let's step back and take stock. We've got a radically efficient shape, wind tunnel data, and actual flight-tested proof that it can get off the ground. A cabin that's competitive with the best widebodies out there. A design that fits existing airports. And simulator work to understand how pilots would handle it. That is a genuinely compelling package. So the obvious question, the one you're probably shouting at your screen right now, is where is it? Why aren't you boarding one next year? And this is where I have to be completely straight with you. Because the honest answer is the most important part of this entire story. The Flying V, in its full-size form, is still years and years away, and it might never happen at all. This is not a plane you'll be flying on soon. Not next year, not this decade, and honestly, maybe not ever. The people closest to the project have said as much, out loud, on the record, which I really respect. They're not overselling it. When KLM's own chief executive talked about when something like this could realistically become normal, he didn't say a few years. He pointed toward around 2050. Let that sink in. The airline sponsoring the project was openly talking about mid-century. Other assessments tied to the program have suggested a sustainable flying wing might be ready sometime around 2040, and that a commercial Flying V wouldn't be carrying paying passengers before roughly then at the very, very earliest. And that's the optimistic red. One of the researchers involved figured it would still take a couple of decades before genuinely revolutionary new passenger aircraft models actually reach the market. So we're talking about a timeline measured in decades, not years. If you're watching this hoping to book a Flying V for your next holiday, I've got tough news. You'll be waiting a very, very long time, if the day ever comes at all. Why so long? A few brutal reasons. And this is where a lot of the hype quietly dies. First, Aviation is one of the most conservative industries on the entire planet, and honestly, for very good reason. When a mistake means people die at 35,000 feet, you do not move fast and break things. Move fast and break things works fine for a phone app. It's a catastrophe for an airliner. The tube and wing design has dominated for a century precisely because it's proven, understood, and certifiable. Every quirk of it has been mapped. Every failure mode has been studied, often the hard way. Mechanics know how to fix it. Pilots know how to fly it. Regulators know how to certify it. A completely new shape throws all of that accumulated knowledge out the window. It has to prove itself all over again, from absolute scratch, against safety standards that were basically written with the old tube and wing design in mind. Think about everything you'd have to reprove. How does it handle an engine failure on takeoff? How do you evacuate it in 90 seconds with half the exits blocked? How does the structure hold up after 20 years and 100,000 pressurization cycles? How does it behave in a stall, in ice, in a crosswind, in a lightning strike? Every single one of those questions has a comfortable, well-documented answer for a conventional jet. For a radical new shape, every answer has to be earned again with test, rigs, and wind tunnels and flight campaigns. That's a mountain of testing, analysis, and regulatory paperwork that takes years and costs staggering, eye-watering amounts of money. As one of the Delft researchers put it, aviation is a relatively conservative industry that tends to develop step by step, and there's good reason the tube and wing has led since the dawn of commercial flight. But, they added, the industry has been getting noticeably more open to new ideas lately, driven by the hard realization that flying genuinely has to become more sustainable. Second, there are still genuinely unsolved technical problems. Remember that Dutch roll, the wobble, the scale model showed? That's a stability challenge that has to be fully tamed before anyone straps a paying passenger into that cabin. Emergency evacuation from a wing-shaped cabin with passengers spread across two angled legs of a V. That's a huge question. Pressurizing that oval structure over tens of thousands of flight cycles without it fatiguing and cracking. Huge question. How the whole thing behaves in turbulence and emergencies at full scale. Another huge question. And the jump from a 22-kilogram model to a full-size aircraft carrying hundreds of human beings is not a small step. It's a canyon. Scaling up in aviation is where a lot of beautiful ideas go to quietly die. Third, and maybe the most decisive of all, is money and will. Building an all-new airliner from a genuinely clean sheet of paper costs tens of billions of dollars. Not millions, billions, with a B, and a lot of them. That's the kind of money where, if you get it wrong, you don't just lose a project, you can threaten the survival of the entire company. So Boeing and Airbus do not launch a new design casually. Almost never, in fact. And here's the crucial insight into how these giants actually think. When they do spend money on improvement, they overwhelmingly prefer to bolt better technology onto shapes they already understand, rather than betting everything on a radical new form. Think about how modern airliners actually get better. A new, more efficient engine, lighter composite materials in the wings, sleeker winglets curling up at the wingtips, smarter aerodynamics refined by a % here and a % there. Each generation of the same basic tube and wing jet quietly gets more efficient without ever scaring passengers, retraining every pilot, or forcing regulators to rewrite the rulebook. It's lower risk, it's proven, and it still delivers real gains. Why gamble the company on a flying V when you can squeeze a few more % out of a design everyone already trusts? That's the trap the flying V sits in. A university can prove a concept. It can fly a model, publish the data, run the simulator, and show the world the idea genuinely works. But that's the relatively cheap part. Turning that concept into a certified, mass-produced, passenger-carrying airliner requires an industrial giant to place an absolutely enormous bet, with its own survival on the line, against the safe, comfortable option of just improving what already sells. And so far, understandably, nobody has been willing to place that bet. The idea isn't held back because it's bad. It's held back because it's expensive, unproven at full scale, and competing against 100 years of momentum. So when you hear a title that says the giants are terrified of this plane, here's the more accurate and honestly more fascinating reality. They're not terrified. They're watching. They participated in the test flights. They fund related research. They know that if the blended wing idea is truly the future, they need to understand it deeply from the inside. But they're also not rushing to build it, because the risks and costs are colossal, and the old design still works and still sells by the thousands. It's not fear. It's a careful, calculated, decades-long dance between what is possible and what is practical. And here's the part that really proves it. The Flying V is not the only blended wing project out there. Not even close. This idea has been circling the giants for years, and they've been chasing it themselves. Take Airbus. Airbus has its own blended wing demonstrator, a project with a name straight out of a fighter pilot movie, MAVERIC. It stands for Model Aircraft for Validation and Experimentation of Robust Innovative Controls. It's a remote-controlled model, roughly 2 meters long and just over 3 meters wide, and it first took to the skies back in June 2019, quietly at an undisclosed location. Airbus then revealed it publicly with some fanfare at the Singapore Air Show in 2020. And guess what fuel-saving figure Airbus quoted for a full-scale version of that design? Up to 20% compared to today's single-aisle jets. Same ballpark as the Flying V. Airbus wasn't afraid of the blended wing. Airbus was building one of its own, and Airbus was chasing the same extra benefits, too. Their engineers pointed out that a blended wing shape opens up new possibilities for where you put the engines. On MAVERIC, the idea was to mount the engine up above the central body, so the aircraft's own structure would shield the ground below from a big chunk of the engine noise. Quieter takeoffs, happier neighbors around airports. And just like the Flying V, that wide body promised a totally different passenger cabin with the potential for more legroom and wider aisles. One of the project's own leaders admitted, honestly, that at first, plenty of people inside and outside the company dismissed MAVERIC as basically a hobby project, something Airbus wouldn't learn much from. They had to prove those doubters wrong by showing it could be a genuinely sound foundation for a future aircraft. Airbus's own head of engineering framed it perfectly. By testing disruptive configurations like this, the company gets to evaluate whether they could become real future products. That is not the language of a company that's terrified. That's the language of a company doing its homework. And then there's Boeing. Boeing has arguably the longest history with this shape of anyone. It goes back decades. In fact, way back in 1997, engineers flew a small propeller-driven blended wing model with a wingspan of around 5 meters, just to study how the shape behaved. That early work led to a serious partnership between Boeing and NASA to develop a proper blended wing research aircraft, which eventually became the X-48. And this wasn't one flight. This was a serious, sustained program that ran for years. The X-48B version made its maiden flight on July 20th, 2007, at NASA's Flight Research Center out in the California desert at Edwards Air Force Base. That first flight lasted 31 minutes and took the remotely piloted aircraft up to 7,500 feet. This was a roughly 8.5% scale model, dynamically designed to fly much like the full-size aircraft would. Then they just kept flying it, and flying it. Between 2007 and 2013, various versions of the X-48 flew around 122 times, 122 flights. At one point, it became the most flown unmanned X-plane in history, which is a genuinely remarkable milestone for such a radical shape. They even built an upgraded version, the X-48C, specifically to test something clever, mounting the engines up on top of the aircraft's body so that the body itself would shield people on the ground from engine noise. That C model flew 30 times, typically for about half an hour per flight, reaching speeds up to around 140 miles per hour and altitudes of about 10,000 feet before wrapping up its testing in 2013. The whole point of all of this was to prove that a blended wing body could be controlled just as safely as a conventional tube-and-wing jet during takeoff, landing, and the tricky, dangerous, low-speed parts of flight. And the results were positive. Boeing's own program manager stated flatly that the tests proved a blended wing could be controlled just as effectively as a normal airliner during those critical phases. There's an interesting distinction between these projects, by the way, and it's worth a quick beat. Airbus aimed MAVERIC's savings at the single-aisle market, the workhorse short and medium-haul jets like the ones you probably fly on most weekends. The Flying V, on the other hand, is aimed squarely at the long-haul, wide-body market, the big ocean-crossing machines. Different targets, same underlying idea that ditching or blending the tube unlocks a big chunk of efficiency. It shows you the blended wing concept isn't a one-trick pony for a single niche. It's a principle that could reshape aircraft across the board, from the jet that takes you on a weekend trip to the one that flies you halfway around the world. Quick question for you while we're here. Drop it in the comments. If you could snap your fingers and have blended wing planes flying tomorrow, which would you want first? Cheaper short-haul hops or greener long-haul flights across the ocean? I'm curious, which one people actually care about more? And if you're finding this interesting, a like and a subscribe genuinely help me make more deep dives like this one. So if Boeing proved it works and Airbus built its own model, why don't we have blended wing airliners right now? Here's the fascinating, deeply human wrinkle. When Boeing studied the classic blended wing concept for carrying passengers, they ran into a problem that had absolutely nothing to do with aerodynamics, drag, or fuel burn. It was psychology. In a mock-up, people just didn't love the cabin. Think about the geometry for a second. In a wide, blended wing, the cabin is enormous and spread out sideways, so a huge number of passengers end up sitting far from any wall, buried deep inside the middle of the wing structure. No window anywhere near them. And for those who are near an edge, the seating can feel like a vast, theater-like room rather than an airplane. Rows and rows spreading out to the sides instead of one familiar tube stretching ahead of you. Now, that might not sound like a big deal until you think about what flying actually does to people. A lot of travelers are already nervous in the air. The window, even if you never look out of it, is a psychological anchor. It tells your brain where you are, that there's an outside, that the world is still there. Take it away. Seat someone in the dead center of a windowless hall, 35,000 feet up, and you've got a comfort problem that no fuel savings can fix. There's even a real challenge around how people handle being in a windowless space during turbulence, when your inner ear says one thing and you have no horizon to confirm it. So Boeing, having proven the blended wing could fly beautifully, shelved it for passenger airliners largely because of how people felt inside it. They kept the concept alive for military uses instead, like long-range transports and aerial refueling tankers, where the cargo doesn't care about a window seat and nobody's booking a honeymoon. And that's the thing the Flying V's V-shape is quietly trying to solve. By splitting the cabin into two legs of a V rather than one enormous windowless cave, the designers were trying to create a layout that feels less like sitting inside a dark auditorium and more like an actual airplane. It's not just about aerodynamics, it's about whether human beings will actually want to sit in the thing. Because you can build the most efficient aircraft in history, and if passengers hate being inside it, airlines won't buy it. The people problem is just as real as the physics problem. And the blended wing race isn't frozen somewhere back in the past, either. The ideas Boeing and NASA proved with the X-48 across all those flights didn't just evaporate when the program wrapped up. The people who understood that work carried it forward. A newer company called Jet Zero, whose founders and senior people include engineers who worked on exactly these blended wing concepts, is now pushing to develop a full-scale blended wing demonstrator of its own. So the torch got passed. The knowledge didn't die with the X-48, it moved. So step back and look at the whole picture. You've got the Flying V from a Dutch university and KLM. You've got MAVERIC from Airbus. You've got a decade plus of X-48 flights from Boeing and NASA. And now you've got new companies picking up the thread. This whole family of radical shapes, all of them, are circling the same fundamental bet. The bet that the humble tube, after a full century of total dominance, might finally be ready to step aside. Nobody knows which of these projects, if any, will be the one that breaks through. But the fact that so many serious players keep coming back to the blended wing, decade after decade, tells you the idea has real gravity. It keeps pulling the best minds in aviation back to it, again and again, because the potential payoff is just too big to ignore. That's the real story hiding behind a title like the giants being afraid. They're not afraid. They're obsessed. They keep circling this shape because deep down, a lot of very smart people suspect it might genuinely be where flying is headed. The only question is, who's willing to bet tens of billions of dollars to find out first? Comment below and tell me honestly, would you actually get on one of these? Would you strap into a seat inside the wing of an aircraft that looks like a giant flying V, knowing it fought its pilots and wobbled through its very first flight? Or would you wait a few decades and let somebody else be the guinea pig? And here's a bonus question I'm genuinely curious about. Would a plane with almost no window seats bother you? Or would you not even care once you're up there? Let me know. I read the comments. Now, there's one more thread to this that makes the future even more interesting. And it's the reason this shape might matter far more than just saving a bit of fuel. That fat, voluminous wing structure could be an ideal home for the fuels of the future. Justus Benad, the man who dreamed up the Flying V concept in the first place, has pointed out that a design like this could integrate hydrogen tanks relatively easily into its shape, something that's genuinely awkward to do in a skinny conventional tube. Here's why that matters so much. Hydrogen is one of the most promising paths to genuinely clean aviation, because when you use hydrogen as fuel, you don't produce carbon dioxide. The exhaust is essentially water vapor. For an industry desperate to cut its climate impact, that's an enormous prize. But hydrogen comes with a brutal catch. It is incredibly bulky. To carry a useful amount of it on an aircraft, you generally have to chill it down into a liquid at absolutely frigid, cryogenic temperatures and store it in big, heavily insulated tanks. And a normal skinny tube and wing jet has nowhere good to put those tanks. You'd have to steal space from the passenger cabin or bolt them on somewhere awkward that ruins your aerodynamics. It's like trying to fit a giant thermos into a design that was never meant to hold one. But a giant, blended wing? Suddenly there's volume everywhere. Suddenly there's genuine room to design those cryogenic tanks right into the thick, spacious structure of the wing itself. Benad specifically pointed this out, that a shape like this could integrate hydrogen tanks relatively easily. So the very same shape that saves you a fifth of your fuel could also, potentially, be the shape that finally makes practical, large-scale hydrogen flight possible. 2 revolutions in one airframe. That's the kind of double payoff that keeps researchers up at night in the best possible way. And this matters because the whole reason places like Delft are chasing these designs is sustainability. Full stop. This is not about building a cool-looking plane for its own sake. Their researchers are working across every single angle of cleaner flight, from radical airframes like the Flying V to hydrogen propulsion, hydrogen storage, and even the messy practical questions nobody thinks about. Like, okay, say you have a hydrogen airliner. How do you actually refuel it at a busy airport, safely, quickly, without the whole operation grinding to a halt? Delft has been part of major European projects tackling exactly that kind of ground operations problem, working alongside Airbus, airport operators, and hydrogen industry companies, backed by serious European funding, to figure out how you'd handle liquid hydrogen at real airports. Delft has also been involved in cryogenic and electric flight research launched through Airbus's innovation efforts in the Netherlands. This is a whole ecosystem of people quietly building the plumbing of a future that doesn't run on kerosene. The Flying V isn't a standalone gimmick floating in isolation. It's one visible, spectacular piece of a much larger, coordinated push to figure out what flying looks like in a world where we simply cannot keep burning fossil fuel forever. The Delft team has been blunt about the stakes. One of their deans put it plainly. Ultimately, we have to fly entirely on sustainable energy. And even if some future aircraft still burns a fuel, the idea is that it would be a synthetic fuel made using captured carbon dioxide, so the whole cycle comes out neutral. Whether the ultimate answer turns out to be better aerodynamics, or hydrogen, or sustainable synthetic fuels, or, most likely, some combination of all three working together, the Flying V is a test bed for thinking way, way outside the tube. It's a 100-year-old industry finally daring to ask whether the shape it settled on a century ago was ever really the best one. And that's the strange, suspended place the Flying V lives in right now. It's too proven to dismiss and too unproven to build. It has flown, but only as a 3-meter model. It has a major airline's blessing, but a timeline stretching toward mid-century. It has the giants' attention, but not their checkbooks. It sits in this fascinating limbo where the engineering says yes, the physics says yes, the sustainability case screams yes, and yet the sheer weight of cost, risk, and 100 years of habit keeps whispering not yet, not yet, not yet. So where does that leave us? With a plane that is proven enough to fly, radical enough to change everything, backed by serious institutions, studied by the very giants it supposedly terrifies, and yet still sitting in that maddening gap between a brilliant idea and a boarding pass. It might be the shape our grandchildren think of as completely normal, the plane in the picture when a kid draws an airliner in the year 2075. Or it might end up as a gorgeous, brilliant idea that history quietly files away as the plane that was almost the future, alongside all the other bold designs that flew, impressed everyone, and never quite made the leap. Because here's the thought that sticks with me, and I want to leave you with it. Every airliner you have ever trusted with your life, the 747, the A320, the Dreamliner, every single one of them was once a terrifying new idea that somebody had to prove. There was a first flight, a rough landing, a wobble that some engineer had to stay up all night to fix. The tube and wing shape you think of as simply what a plane is was itself a bold bet somebody made a century ago, and plenty of people thought those early designs were insane too. The Flying V might join that list, or it might not. Right now, nobody, not the students who built it, not the airlines watching it, not the giants circling it, can tell you for absolute certain whether you'll ever board one. And there's something oddly beautiful about that honesty. We're used to slick corporate announcements promising us the future is already here. This is the opposite. This is real science, in real time, where the ending genuinely hasn't been written yet, where a brilliant idea has to fight its way through cost and caution and doubt, and might win or might not. But here's what nobody can take away from this project. That little 3-meter model did lift off from a German runway. It did fly. It wobbled, it landed hard, it fought its pilot, and it flew. Against a century of saying planes have to look a certain way, this strange V-shaped thing left the ground and stayed in the air. And sometimes, that is exactly how the entire future of the sky begins. Not with a finished airliner rolling out of a factory to applause, but with one strange shape, one nervous pilot standing on the ground with a controller in his sweaty hands, a couple of teammates reading numbers off a screen, and one wobbly, imperfect, absolutely real first flight. If this blew your mind even a little, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. I've got a whole hangar full of stories like this, and trust me, the sky is far stranger than you think. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.